A single email lands in a bank's compliance inbox. No sirens, no speeches, no headlines, just a note with a list of names, a few account numbers, and one sentence that carries the weight of an ultimatum. Touch this money and the global system will touch you back. Within minutes, transfers stall. Insurance providers step away. Ships hesitate at sea. Companies cancel contracts they signed in good faith because one financial hub has decided the risk is no longer worth it. That quiet moment is the real opening scene of modern sanctions. And it leads to the question this analysis is built around. The story does not start with a missile or a vote. It starts with paperwork. And paperwork can change history. If sanctions are designed to isolate bad actors, why do they keep producing new alliances and even new systems built to survive without the United States? Sanctions used to sound like a temporary punishment, a slap on the wrist, a diplomatic tool meant to pressure a government, then fade once behavior changed. That is not what they have become. The argument here is simple and heavy at the same time. US sanctions are no longer just policy decisions. They are structural forces, slow-moving, continent-shifting pressures that change how states trade, how money moves, and who trusts whom. Think of plate tectonics. Nothing seems to move day to day. Then, one day, the map looks different. This is an analysis of how the weaponization of the US dollar and global trade networks is redrawing global alliances, sometimes in ways Washington intended, and often in ways it did not. To keep this clear and reusable, this analysis follows a framework with 5 steps. 1. What sanctions are, stripped of jargon. 2. Why presidents love them. 3. How the United States can enforce them globally. Weaponized interdependence. 4. The predictable reaction, survival-driven alignment and the crank axis. And 5. The plumbing, the parallel pipes being built to bypass the dollar. By the end, the listener should be able to recognize the pattern in tomorrow's headlines without needing anyone's talking points. At its simplest, a sanction is a restriction on an economic or political action that would otherwise happen naturally. It is a government stepping in and saying no, you cannot sell this product to that country. No, you cannot travel to that city. No, you cannot open a bank account for that person. No, you cannot insure that shipment. Sanctions are barriers inserted deliberately into flows of goods, money, and relationships. And historically, this is not new. There is a long, messy lineage here. Early embargoes, collective security experiments, and the blunt, physical logic of economic warfare in the pre-digital era. The old world of sanctions was about stopping physical goods from moving. It was blockades, it was ships, it was sieges, it required muscle. That older model mattered, but it was limited, it was expensive, it was slow, and it often backfired. Then after 9/11, something changed. If the first era of sanctions was about stopping ships, the modern era is about stopping permission. In the early 2000s, policymakers realized the war on terror was not only about geography or battlefield movement, it was also about money. How funds move, how they are cleared, and how modern networks make clandestine financing possible. And in that era, one truth stood out. Most international transactions at some point touch a system tied to the United States because the dollar is the global reserve currency and because the US sits at the center of the global banking architecture. Money, in other words, has choke points. Once that is understood, sanctions stop being about ships at sea. They become about servers, clearinghouses, messaging systems, and compliance departments. The instrument becomes quieter, but the reach becomes larger. This is where smart sanctions and financial weapons take center stage. Not a battleship, but a letter to a bank saying, in effect, if you touch this money, you are in trouble. And that brings the story to the next question. Why do presidents reach for sanctions first? Sanctions are seductive because they feel like the middle option. Imagine the menu of choices in any crisis. Option A. Diplomacy and speeches. It can look weak. It can feel like doing nothing. Option B. Military force. It is expensive. It risks lives. It can spiral. Sanctions sit between them. Severe costs imposed on an adversary without putting troops in body bags. They feel clean, antiseptic, technocratic, warfare by spreadsheet. That perception is part of the problem, because even if sanctions look clean from the perspective of the sender, they can produce global messes that last far beyond the immediate target. So the real story is not only what sanctions do to the sanctioned state, it is what sanctions do to the system. To understand that, the how matters. How does the United States even have this kind of reach? There's a framework that explains this with unusual clarity. Weaponized interdependence. It starts by rejecting a comforting myth that the global economy is a flat marketplace where everyone can simply trade around disruptions. The global economy is not flat. It is a network, and important networks have hubs. The airline analogy makes the point. A small town does not fly directly to a small town on the other side of the planet. The route goes through hubs, major airports, major connectors. Global finance is built the same way. The United States sits at critical hubs, dollar clearing, core financial infrastructure, and the systems through which payments and messaging are routed. When a state sits at a hub, it gains two superpowers. First, the panopticon effect. In the classic panopticon prison design, the guard watches from a central tower. The prisoners never know when they are being watched, but the architecture makes watching possible. In global finance, or when transactions route through systems tied to US banks and US dollar clearing, visibility becomes possible. The second superpower is the chokepoint effect. If the hub can see flows, the hub can also deny flows. This is where the pressure becomes real, not only on the target, but on everyone connected to the target. A bank in France, a company in China, a shipper in the Gulf. They can be told, do business with the sanctioned actor and lose access to the US-centered hub, meaning lose access to the dollar. For a global institution, losing access to dollar finance is not an inconvenience. It is a death sentence, financial cardiac arrest. So in practice, the choice becomes simple. Do business with the sanctioned actor and die, or comply and survive. This is why sanctions have become so powerful. The network does the enforcement, and once that enforcement power is visible, it triggers the most predictable reaction in international politics. A grim but useful lens helps here: neo-realism. It begins with a bleak assumption. The number one priority of any state is survival, not prosperity, not morality, survival. Through that lens, the United States, sitting at the center of the system, with visibility and a vital switch, looks less like a neutral administrator and more like an existential risk. And survival logic does what survival logic always does. It forces adaptation. States do not merely complain about the system. They attempt to escape it. They restructure their behavior to remove the vulnerability. They seek alternative pipes, alternative partners, and alternative protections. This is where the present moment matters. The question is not whether pressure works. The question is what pressure builds. In January 2026, the second Trump administration had been in power for exactly 1 year. Looking back across 2025, the doctrine around sanctions shifted. The year was defined by a more explicit, more aggressive posture, what the conversation described as maximum pressure 2.0. The premise was straightforward. Prior sanctions regimes were too porous, too many loopholes, too much evasion. The solution was brute force economic coercion, going after the supply chain, the financing, the insurance, and the third parties. 3 case studies capture the logic. Russia was already sanctioned heavily after the invasion of Ukraine, but in October 2025, the Treasury Department designated major Russian energy pillars, Rosneft and Lukoil, an escalation meant to strangle revenue and force a ceasefire. The message to the world was not subtle. Touch this oil, finance it, insure it, and become radioactive to the US system. In the return of maximum pressure on Iran, the focus was not only on institutions, it was on logistics. The shadow fleet became a central target. Over 180 vessels were sanctioned in late 2025, physical ships used to move sanctioned oil, paired with direct warnings toward Chinese refineries, stop buying, or risk being locked out of U.S. finance, supplier, shipper, customer, the entire chain. There was also a moment that cut against the overall trajectory, sanctions relief. In June 2025, after the Assad regime fell in late 2024, the United States lifted certain sanctions, publicly framed around humanitarian access and reconstruction, but also tied to a strategic signaling function, because a sanctions regime that cannot be lifted becomes a trap. If the target believes the pain is permanent, no off-ramp, no forgiveness, then there is no incentive to comply. That is the implicit promise, the credibility that sanctions can end. This matters because credibility determines whether sanctions produce behavior change or only resistance. As pressure intensifies, countries that do not naturally trust one another begin to coordinate because they are pushed into the same corner. Some analysts label this the Krink axis: China, Russia, Iran, North Korea. The name may sound awkward, the dynamic is not, but it is crucial to be precise. This is not NATO. It is not a marriage. It is not a values-based alliance with integrated command structures. It is a transactional survival pact. The binding force is not shared ideology. It is shared exposure to the US dollar system and a shared need to survive the choke point. That cooperation shows up in several ways. Bilateral trade between Russia and China has surged, and as of late 2025, over 90% of that trade is settled in rubles or yuan, an explicit bypass of the dollar. When there is no dollar, the panopticon goes dark and the choke point weakens. The cooperation is not only economic, it spills into hard security, transfers, manufacturing, and supplied relationships that tie sanctioned states together because they are increasingly reliant on one another. China's role is distinct because its economy remains deeply integrated with Western markets. Beijing has incentives to support partners, but not at the cost of crippling its own core financial institutions. So, firewalls appear. Small, disposable banks without dollar exposure handle sanctioned trade. If one gets sanctioned, it can be shut down and replaced. It is a shell game designed to protect the core while still keeping the system running. This is not a romantic alliance. It is pragmatism under pressure. And it is not the only story. Because between the United States and this emerging bloc sits a group that may matter even more. The most consequential countries for the future may be the ones refusing to pick a side. Think of major middle powers: India, Turkey, the UAE, Saudi Arabia, and Indonesia. These are not peripheral actors. They are engines of growth and power, and they are practicing what can be called strategic autonomy. They want access to Western technology and markets, and they also want discounted energy, alternative partners, and flexibility. They want the best of both worlds. That hedging caused a major flashpoint in 2025. In August 2025, the United States imposed a 25% secondary tariff on India, an aggressive attempt to punish a third party for buying Russian oil. With existing tariffs, the total reached 50% on some goods. The coercive logic was clear: reduce Russian revenue by pressuring a major buyer. But the response did not produce submission. India did not blink. Instead, the posture hardened, energy ties with Russia deepened, and public discussions emerged about rupee-ruble mechanisms designed to bypass the dollar. This is the pattern. Coercion aimed at discipline can become a lesson in exit, and countries like Turkey and the UAE have played another role entirely, becoming logistical hubs for evasion through transshipment, buying restricted goods legally, then reselling them onward in ways that are hard to police. Sanctions enforcement becomes a whack-a-mole game. Close one shell company, two more appear. Over time, leaks become channels, channels become pipes. Which brings the story to the least glamorous but most decisive part of this entire transformation. De-dollarization used to sound like a slogan. In 2025, it started looking like engineering. The question is not whether a new order can be announced. It is whether a new order can be built quietly through infrastructure. Several pieces of that infrastructure stand out. China's cross-border interbank payment system, CIPS, functions as a homegrown alternative to SWIFT, the Western dominant messaging system used by banks. As of early 2026, CIPS is processing 9.6 trillion yuan daily. That is enough volume to run a large parallel economy, and Russia's own domestic system, SPFS, connects into that network, linking pipes. More futuristic and more unsettling from a US perspective is mBridge, a pilot project involving central banks, including China, the UAE, Thailand, and Hong Kong, using central bank digital currencies. The significance is not technological novelty, it is strategic bypass. Transactions can move peer-to-peer through a shared ledger without touching a New York correspondent bank. No dollar, no US server, no obvious choke point. Not all solutions are high-tech. Some are almost ancient. Barter arrangements and infrastructure for oil deals designed to avoid the banking system entirely. If the payment never becomes a bank transfer, there is nothing to freeze. And then there is the physical layer. Ships. The shadow fleet is a ghost armada of aging tankers owned through anonymous shell companies, insured outside Western markets, and operated with tactics designed to disappear from standard tracking, turning off transponders and conducting ship-to-ship transfers to obscure origin. It is riskier, more expensive, more dangerous. But if the alternative is economic collapse, states pay the price. This is what sanctions have helped produce: parallel money, parallel insurance, parallel logistics. And once those exist, institutions emerge to shelter them. For years, BRICS was treated as a talk shop. In 2025, perceptions shifted. The bloc expanded, adding states including Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the UAE, Indonesia, and Saudi Arabia. The membership matters not only because of size, but because of what it represents. A club that now controls roughly 40% of global oil production and nearly 45% of the world's population. More important than the numbers is the motivation. BRICS is increasingly viewed as insurance, protection against American leverage, and a framework for alternatives. Financial access through institutions like the New Development Bank when Western systems become conditional or closed. This is what a parallel order looks like in slow motion. Not a single revolution, but a series of practical escapes that accumulate. Now the story goes to the most dramatic example: Venezuela and the capture of Maduro following Operation Absolute Resolve. In that narrative, sanctions worked. They inflicted pain. They hollowed out capacity. They paved the way for action. On a tactical level, the tool did what it was designed to do, but the strategic picture is darker. Because while sanctions isolate targets in the short term, they also teach the world how to build immunity in the long term. Every time the network is weaponized, incentives grow to build a shield against it. That is the decoupling dilemma. The more aggressively sanctions are used, the faster the world invests in bypass. And once bypass is built, leverage erodes, not only against adversaries, but against everyone who wants insurance against future coercion. This is why the implicit promise matters so much. If countries believe sanctions are permanent, or that the goalposts move endlessly, then compliance stops being rational. Exit becomes rational, and exit, once engineered, does not easily reverse. Here is the final thought. If control of the financial system and the dominance of the US dollar is the core source of American power in the 21st century, and constant use of sanctions is incentivizing the world to build systems that abandon the dollar, is the United States cutting the very branch it is sitting on? That is not a rhetorical flourish. It is a multi-trillion-dollar question. And the answer, whatever it is, will shape the next 50 years of world politics. Thank you for staying with the analysis. I will see you in the next perspective.